In the book of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 21 through 46, we find a famous passage concerning judgment. In this passage, we find some very important truths that play a major part in determining our soul's eternal destiny. In each pronouncement of judgment, these words stand out, with not being added to the negative. For I was a hungered, and ye gave me meat, or food. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in, or showed hospitality. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. Food, drink, clothing, shelter, hospitality, time. Brethren, these were not major actions that had to be performed. They seem so very small and insignificant. But Jesus tells us that these seemingly little things will be a big part of the judgment proceedings. When we think about truths such as these, we come to the realization that with God, little things mean a great deal. We live in a world today that believes that we must be very elaborate and extensive with our actions. When we do simply the little things, we are viewed many times as not doing nearly enough. But what we need to realize is that throughout God's Word we see many instances where little things are proven to be much more important to God. In the book of Proverbs, in the term little, we find it used a number of times, each time serving as an attention getter. In Proverbs 6, verses 9 through 11, Solomon wrote, "How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard, or lazy person? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, yet a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that travaileth, and thy want as an armed man." Also in chapter 30, verses 24 through 28, we find a very interesting observation about these little things. "There be 4 things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceeding wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. The conies, or the rabbits, are but a feeble folk, yet make they their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet go they forth, all of them by bands. The spider taketh hold with her hands, and is in kings' palaces." The Apostle John continually makes use of the word little in his first epistle, while referring to his readers. In 1 John 2 and verse 1, John writes, "My little children, these things write I unto you, that ye sin not. And if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." This expression, little children, is used in this way throughout this epistle. It's found at least 6 more times, and the epistle ends in chapter 5 and verse 21 in this way: "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." The Apostle John showed great love and devotion to those who would be reading this epistle by referring to them in this way. Many of them likely were viewed as his children in the faith, meaning that he was the one who had led them to the truth. This in no way is taking the position of father away from God, but simply was a way that people in the first century showed their love and respect for those who had led them to the truth. In 1 Timothy 1 and verse 2, Paul refers to Timothy in this way as his son in the faith. But with these things being said, I would like for us to consider some little things that mean a lot. Number 1, we consider the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There are many examples of God using little things in a big way throughout the Bible, starting with the tree of knowledge of good and evil and its forbidden fruit. Single trees many times are overlooked as being small, insignificant things. But in this case, God used one tree as a representation of everything that is right and wrong. Man in the beginning was created a holy, moral being, created in God's likeness. They were placed in the garden and told they could eat of the fruit of any tree, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This tree, by its being forbidden, served as a contrast with the other trees in the garden. But God made it very plain that the fruit of this tree was not to be consumed. In Genesis 2, verses 16 and 17, God commanded the man, saying, "Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." And we know the rest of the story. We all know how very big this little thing became when it was proven that man could not even maintain his moral status. Mankind has had to face great punishment as a result of the great sin committed as a result of this one seemingly small thing. These consequences are still experienced by mankind today. Friends, little things can mean a lot. But then what about Moses and his rod? Moses and his rod are very impressive in showing us how God uses little things in a big way. After Moses' 40 years in exile following the killing of an Egyptian, God appeared to him in the form of a burning bush in Exodus 3, verses 2 through 10. And God tells Moses to go back to Egypt and deliver the children of Israel out of bondage. After considering everything that this would entail, Moses was very reluctant to go. Just think, he was already in exile for killing an Egyptian. He was one man going up against the strongest nation on the planet at that time. He was demanding the release of the nation's slaves who had built cities for the Egyptians. This certainly would have seemed like an impossible task. But God reassures Moses that he would be with him, and he would send his brother to be his spokesman before Pharaoh. As God continues to question Moses, we come to Exodus chapter 4, verses 2 through 4. And God asks Moses, "What is that in thine hand?" And he said, "A rod." And he said, "Cast it on the ground." And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it. And the Lord said to Moses, "Put forth thine hand, and take it by the tail." And he put forth his hand, and caught it. And it became a rod in his hand. This makes for very interesting reading. But yet we see how God used this simple rod in many different instances during the time of the Exodus. We read of the rod becoming a snake and consuming the rods of the magicians. We see Moses stretching forth the rod and it bringing forth frogs and dust. Him stretching forth the rod and it bringing hail upon Egypt. Stretching forth the rod and it brought forth locusts. He stretched out the rod, and it parted the Red Sea, and then closed it again. It brought forth water from the rock by striking it with the rod. Holding up the rod made it possible for the Israelites to be victorious in battle. Time after time, we find this insignificant object used in very significant ways. But what about David? We have an instant of David using something very small to accomplish something very large. When David was still a very young man, he had come to visit with his older brothers who were a part of King Saul's army. At the time of his visit, the Israelite army was in a standoff with the Philistines. They faced one another from adjacent mountaintops with the valley of Elah between them. And every day, a giant named Goliath would come into the valley and would taunt the Israelites into fighting him. But no one was willing to step forward and accept this challenge, especially from a man who was about 10 feet tall. Well, along comes little David. David caught up with his brothers and was informed about what was taking place. And David was greatly disturbed that this heathen man and his army was defying and speaking so evil to the Lord's people. Therefore he personally volunteered to go and face this giant, much to the dismay of his brothers. This account is found in 1 Samuel 17. David was provided with armor like the rest of the soldiers, but he refused. So he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook. He put them in his shepherd's bag, and he took his sling, which was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Well, of course, David was mocked and belittled by Goliath, and to this David replied that he had come in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. David ran to meet the giant, took 1 smooth stone from the bag, put it in his sling, let it fly, and the stone hit Goliath in the forehead, and he fell down. That which was little was used in such a big way. 1 small stone put this blasphemous giant to silence. Well, you may be wondering, why did David take 5 stones when it only took him 1? We read in 2 Samuel 21 and verse 22 that there were actually 4 other giants among the Philistine army. It's possible that David was getting ready just in case he had to face them all. Little things certainly can be used in a big way. We also find the example of Elijah, a poor widow, and her barrel of meal and cruse of oil. When considering God using these little things in a big way, we do not need to forget this instance with Elijah and the poor widow near Zidon. This account is found in 1 Kings 17, verses 1 through 16. This was during the time that God showed his displeasure with the idolatrous practices of King Ahab by causing a long drought to plague the land of Israel. The streams dried up, the food supply became very scarce. But we see that God took care of Elijah in some amazing ways. Part of the time before the streams dried up, the ravens brought food to Elijah. But following this, he was sustained by a poor widow who herself had run out of food. But following God's instructions, Elijah went to this woman and requested food. And we see in 1 Kings 17, verses 12 through 16, "And she said, As the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. And Elijah said to her, Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and thy son. For thus saith the Lord God of Israel, The barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah, and she and he and her house did eat many days. And the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Elijah." These are amazing accounts. Elijah, this poor widow, and her son, they passed the remaining 3.5 years of famine, always having sufficient food, because the meal and the oil never ran out. Little became a lot when God had something to do with it. Then we turn to the New Testament. Again, we find that little becomes a lot in the hands of God. This stands out greatly in the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 by Christ. This event of feeding the 5,000 was so impressive that it is recorded in all 4 gospel accounts. Jesus and his disciples went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, seeking rest and relaxation. Seeing where Jesus was heading, the people along the coast flocked to him. And although he was tired and seeking rest, Jesus' compassion would not allow him to turn these people away. He taught them, he healed them, but it was getting late and the people had forgotten to bring food. The disciples wanted to send the people away, but Jesus found a little boy who had 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. The circumstances were very similar with the 4,000. They had 7 loaves and a few little fish. In each case, the Lord prayed, and what was little became much. The supply multiplied and became seemingly unending. From this small amount, Christ fed 5,000 and 4,000, not including the women and children, and there was food left over. Little becomes much when God is involved in it. These little things were used by God in a very big way. We think about also the little town of Bethlehem, and how in this small town, this was the place where the Messiah would be born. This was a very small village, and it was a place where Jesus would be born in the most humble manner. Jesus lived and grew up in Nazareth, of which it was asked in John 1 and verse 46, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Then his life ended in Jerusalem on the cross. And we can read in 1 Corinthians 1 verses 18 through 31 and see how little the cross was thought of in the first century. In fact, it was typically only used to execute slaves and criminals of the worst kind. The cross was despised by mankind, and it's interesting to note that the Son of God passed away in such a humble fashion. Little things, they mean so much when God has something to do with them. That which was regarded with utter contempt has now become a symbol of great respect and great dignity. Thank you for joining us for our program today. May God bless you with a wonderful day.